Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We have a special treat for you today in recognition of the April 15th tax filing deadline, something I know everyone looks forward to. Leading off, we have none other than Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform, making the case for his No New Taxes pledge. He'll be followed by former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, Professor Robert Reich, urging us to tax the rich. Let's get right to it. Calling in from the heart of the vast right-wing conspiracy, we have a man who has been more thoroughly demonized by tax and spend advocates than Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Grover, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Grover, I understand you were born in Weston, Massachusetts and educated at Harvard. What went wrong?
I paid no attention in school. That's what went right. No, actually, when you grow up in a left-of-center school system and university, it actually sharpens your reasoning, your debating skills. If you ask questions and the professors can't answer them very well, it really convinces you that perhaps the left is not correct. And I was up against the best the left had at Harvard, living in the Boston area.
And you stuck around for your MBA. The undergraduate degree wasn't enough?
Well, business school was non-political. They weren't conservatives. They were non-political. There's guys who wanted to go run consulting firms and investment bankers and become Romney, which is about as non-political as you get in life. So I wanted to learn the skills of management, but I knew by the time I'd graduated from college and before I went to business school that I wanted to take what skills I could put together and focus on changing the world.
You know, in terms of collecting skills at college, I understand you did a stint on stage as part of Hasty Pudding's theatricals. What did you take away from that?
Well, I sort of did a little of everything. I hung out a bit with the Harvard Crimson people and this very left-wing student newspaper. I wrote a sports article on Harvard's baseball team. I don't follow sports as well as I ought to. I have no business writing a sports article, but I did write one, probably the worst written sports reporting in the history of Western civilization. Hasty Pudding was a fun collection of arts guys that do...
well, they're famous for cross-dressing musicals. Did you ever act in drag?
No, I did not.
That would be a good tape to have.
I worked with them. I hung out with all of our friends in the comedy magazine. We had a lot of fun doing different things. I worked with a weekly school paper. I joined all sorts of clubs as a way to, meet people and do different things. Hasty Puddings was part of that.
You seem to have an agenda. It's reported that you volunteered to work on the 1968 Nixon campaign at the age of 12 years old?
Absolutely, 12.
What causes a prepubescent kid to get interested in politics?
I was political early on foreign policy issues. My public library in Weston, Massachusetts sold off all of their Cold War anti-communist books for a nickel or a dime. I Led Three Lives by Herb Philbrick, all the books by J. Edgar Hoover, Masters of Deceit, and I took them home and I read them and decided the Soviet Union was a problem and a danger, and I looked up and Nixon seemed to be taking it seriously going into 1968, and the Democrats didn't.
Well, I have to ask, because we were in college here in Boston at about the same time. I was down the river getting a technical degree. What was it like being conservative at Harvard in Boston at that time while the rest of us were smoking pot and protesting against the draft?
Well, the largest club on campus at Harvard when I was there, 74 to 78, was the Harvard Republican Club.
No.
So there were lots of students who were Republicans and even conservatives, just close to zero professors. Even the ones who thought of themselves as Republicans would not have voted for Reagan in the primaries in 76.
Well, some things haven't changed.
Yeah. So we had a lot of students. We had a Student Libertarian Association. It was called Sons of Liberty, but we elected a woman to be the president. She asked if we could change it to Harvard Libertarian Association instead of Sons of Liberty, since she wasn't. So it was a good collection of folks. Unlike some places, Dartmouth, where the conservatives felt completely embattled and set up the Dartmouth Review, Harvard was a little lighter of touch. People were surprised that you were a conservative, but it wasn't considered impossible.
Did you ever grow your hair long?
When I was in high school and before I went to college, I had it at my shoulders. It was in college at some point that I shortened it.
Oh, we got to find those pictures. Before we get on to the serious matters, I see that Wikipedia lists you as being active in two major organizations, Americans for Tax Reform, which of course we're going to talk about, and the Islamic Free Market Institute. What is an Islamic free market, and what's your interest in that?
That's a group that in the late 90s we put together. I worked with Toward Tradition, which is a free market Orthodox Jewish group. Rabbi Lapin, Daniel Lapin, chaired that. Because there are always efforts by political people to hijack various religions and explain that religion is really socialism. So you see efforts within the Catholic Church of the liberation theologists to say that Christianity is socialism. There's some liberal Protestant efforts to do the same thing to Protestantism. Within the Jewish community, there are people who argue that Judaism is just another word for liberalism. Actually, it's a religion. It's written down, and it's very compatible with free markets and property rights. And there wasn't a similar effort within the Muslim community, particularly overseas. So I was supportive of an effort by some friends to put together the Islamic Free Market Institute, which did 4 international conferences over in Qatar in the Middle East, talking about how property rights are perfectly consistent with the Quran and free trade and economic growth, co-sponsored with the Heritage Foundation and Republicans Abroad and the University of Doha
that
over
must
there.
Have been interesting.
It was a very good effort to promote the argument against those people who think that Islam means the 12th century.
Well, something must have worked. I just got back from Dubai recently, and that is just an economic miracle that you have to see to understand in terms of what happens when you turn free markets and free trade and low taxes loose on a patch of sand. It was pretty impressive over there.
Oh, absolutely. I'm working now through one of the spin-offs from Americans for Tax Reform, the Property Rights Alliance, which works on property rights, with the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto. And he has pointed out that one of the successes is the United States, after we won World War II, in Japan, we established property rights and property ownership in land and created a judiciary that would protect those property rights. And as a result, you had strong economic growth. And that the same thing was done in Peru to defeat the terrorists there, the Shining Path terrorists, who were taking advantage of the fact that poor people didn't own property and didn't have anything out in the countryside or in the cities. But once you protected their property rights and people who were squatting on land
you unlock a lot of capital.
Yes, and that's true all around the world. And Hernando de Soto has done a good analysis of the Arab Spring and points out of the 63 people who burned themselves in protest, the guy in Tunisia was the first one who set it off, but there were 62 others from Morocco over to Israel. Not one of them said, I want an election on Tuesday. Not one of them said, I don't get to go to church often enough. Every one of them had been expropriated, their business or their land.
Wow.
This was a property rights revolt, and it won't get settled just by having elections. And what we need to do is establish property rights for the dispossessed in each of these countries.
That's a totally unreported fact. How is it possible that we don't know this?
Well, Hernando de Soto has written about it in the Wall Street Journal. It's just that the Wilsonian mythology is if you have elections, that creates freedom.
Yeah.
Elections are a good way to protect freedom, but elections don't get you there. Witness Zimbabwe.
Yeah, sure.
You don't take an unfree society, tell everybody to go have an election, and end up with property rights and rule of law.
Well, they just had an election in Crimea.
Yes, they just had an election in Crimea. And it's unlikely that they'll have a second election in Crimea.
One man, one vote, one time. Hey, let's get on to taxes. That's really why I wanted to get you on the show. Talk about the Americans for Tax Reform and ask you right up front, since we're in Massachusetts, so very few people probably are aware of this, what is the Taxpayer Protection Pledge?
Certainly. The Taxpayer Protection Pledge is a written commitment. It simply says, I promise my voters and the people in my state and in the United States that I'll vote against any and all efforts to raise taxes. So no net tax increase. You can do tax reform, shift taxes around, but no net tax increase. Today, a majority of the members of the House of Representatives, almost all the Republicans, but a majority of the total House have made that commitment and kept it. 39 to 40 senators, U.S. senators, over 1,000 state legislators, about 16 governors have made these commitments. And the Democrats, the President of the United States, and Harry Reid, the Democratic leader of the Senate, have said, these people have promised Grover Norquist not to raise taxes. Actually, if you read the pledge, it's online at our website, atr.org. The pledge is to the American people and to their constituents.
But are you not the enforcer?
Not the enforcer. The American people, the American voters, are the enforcer of people keeping their word. We share the pledge with candidates, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, incumbents, challengers, make sure everybody has the opportunity to sign it, highlight who has signed it, and if anyone breaks it, we certainly highlight that as much as possible in the press. But if the American people wanted higher taxes, taking the pledge would be a negative and breaking it would be a positive. The good news is the American people do not want their taxes raised.
So you're not an exterminator, you just shine your light on cockroaches.
That's it.
And so far, though, you haven't gotten one congressman from Massachusetts to sign the pledge. Now, what are you doing wrong?
I hate to say this because I grew up in Massachusetts prior to emigrating to the United States, and I'm very fond of the Bay State. My parents live up there. But with the exception of Scott Brown, have not been sending people who represent taxpayers to Washington, D.C. They've been sending people to Washington, D.C. to represent the interests of Washington, D.C. against the interests of the people of Massachusetts.
Now, I understand there's actually a movement now in Massachusetts to reform our state tax. We have a 5.2% income tax, and they're trying to make it a progressive tax. Are you following that effort at all?
I am. This is take number 6. I am old enough to remember 5 different efforts starting in 1978 where Democrats, big government advocates, big spenders, have put on the ballot in Massachusetts, let's go to a graduated or progressive income tax. 5 times it's been defeated by the voters.
Only has to win once.
Yes, that's true. They keep coming back. The fight for liberty is never settled, never over.
Do you think they have a shot at it this time?
I think it's possible because you always have to be careful. But Barbara Anderson, who chairs the Citizens for Limited Taxation, the very competent and serious, grown-up, hardworking taxpayer organization in Massachusetts, has defeated this over and over again. And I believe with Citizens for Limited Taxation's leadership and the common sense of the people of Massachusetts, we will again vote down the idea that the government should discriminate between and against people when they raise taxes.
Well, that'll be an interesting quest to follow. The Americans for Tax Reform has become quite an institution in Washington. I've only attended your infamous Wednesday meetings once as a guest. What can you tell us about these meetings without making us take a pledge of omerta?
Certainly. We put together a meeting. This has been going on for 20 years now. We started with about 20 people. We now have about 150 plus who come once a week. We meet in a rather large conference room. There's sort of stadium seating, so if you're back 4 rows, you're up a couple feet, so everybody can see everybody else and lean into the conversation. 20 to 30 people will present for 3 minutes each. So we have a very quick, here's what's happening, here's what I'm doing. It means that the center-right, Reagan Republican, conservative movement knows what all the players are doing.
And you're the station master. You keep the trains moving on time.
Yes. My job is to make sure everybody who wants to talk talks. My job is not to talk. It's not to tell people they're wrong, but to get everyone to say, here's what we're working on, here's what we're doing, and other people can decide, I want to help do that, I want to work with you on that.
Coalition building.
It makes for a much better informed and educated collection of activists. If you live in silos and you never know what else is going on, you have no idea how many potential friends you have.
Interesting. Who stands behind Americans for Tax Reform? It's a not-for-profit. You do raise money. Who's behind you?
We have about 100,000 members, and we do direct mail. We raise money on the Internet, no government funds whatsoever, and it's just a broad array of supporters.
Now, you've been attacked by the left for being funded by nefarious individual rich people. I got to ask you, if Ralph Nader disclosed his list of donors, would you disclose yours?
No, because the IRS is not harassing the donors or supporters of left-wing groups, and we know from painful experience that they target conservative groups. I served on the Commission on Restructuring the IRS, a congressional commission back in the late 90s, and actually asked the head of the IRS. As a commissioner, I said, I have talked to my left of center friends. None of them are being audited or investigated or yelled at. I have talked to a number of conservative groups, Heritage, National Rifle Association, Citizens Against Government Waste. They're being harassed by the IRS and audited and so on. And why are you picking on conservatives? And he said, oh, but we're not. And I said, how do you decide who you audit if you're not doing it on a political basis? Oh, that's a secret. You'll have to trust us. It just happens that everybody we're hitting are conservative groups.
But the IRS investigation scandal seems to be stalled and is going nowhere in Washington. I mean, people make noise about it, but you've got leading members of the IRS taking the Fifth Amendment. It doesn't seem to be getting any traction.
Well, I think it's getting traction in the sense that we are actually getting documents from the IRS more slowly than should happen, but it is getting done. It's going to take us a while trying to get into the heart of that organization. You saw the head of the IRS taking the Fifth Amendment, which means she broke the rules, broke the law, and doesn't want to go to jail for it. That's a pretty stinging self-indictment.
Doesn't look like a whole lot is taking place in Congress these days, given the high degree of partisanship. Is there any hope for serious tax reform while Obama is still president?
No. Look, nothing good happens as long as Obama is president because the Democrats, at least for a year, have the Senate and for 3 years have the presidential veto. They can and will stop anything useful. On the other hand, nothing terribly awful gets to pass and become law of the land because the Republican House will stop that from happening. So we have gridlock or stalemate here in Washington, D.C., nothing good, nothing bad. The total level of spending is set by the sequester. That's useful. It keeps it low, can't creep up. The tax policy is largely fixed. Since the Bush tax cuts, 85% of them were made permanent. So the president cannot raise taxes, significant tax increases just by sitting on his hands, which he could have done prior to making much of those tax cuts permanent. The real activity, good or bad, takes place in the 50 states. 24 states have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican governor, and more than half the country lives in a state that is wholly run by Republicans, like Texas or Florida or Georgia or North Dakota or Michigan or Ohio.
Is federalism writ large. When you say things are moving at the state level, give us an example.
At the state level, 24 Republican states, they're expanding school choice. 380,000 children in Louisiana have a $5,000 voucher to take to any school, public or private. 500,000 in Indiana. 9.6 million Americans have concealed carry permits because 41 states have shall issue concealed carry. Massachusetts has may issue, so you can't get a gun permit in Boston, but you can in most towns around Massachusetts. So we're changing the nature of the electorate because more people are getting self-employed in those 24 states, more private sector jobs, fewer government sector jobs. The labor laws are shifting so that people aren't forced to pay union dues. Right to work passed in Michigan and in Indiana. Right to work for public sector workers just passed in Wisconsin. So the actual electorate is changing. As you give people more freedoms, they'll never let you take them away. 13 states, like Massachusetts, are all Democrat-controlled. And they can turn themselves into California or Greece as quickly as they want to, and they're working at it.
So we've got gridlock or checks and balances, depending on your point of view, in the legislature, but the regulatory state is still running full bore. There are regulations coming out at a never-ending pace. These has major impact on the economy. In that sense, isn't gridlock bad?
Well, the alternative to gridlock was a continuation of a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic President doing crazy things legislatively, laws that would last forever. The president has turned to rule by fiat, rule by regulation. All of those regulations can be undone by a next president. And therefore, while they are damaging and unhelpful to the economy, and in fact, there are 1 million people do not have jobs today because Obama, his personal decision to not let them have the permits, whether it's that pipeline through the Midwest or other energy efforts, that's very costly to 1 million people and their families that are unemployed because of the president's decisions. That said, That can be fixed with a different president.
Let's talk a little about the Republican Party and its future. It seems to be standing at a crossroads. From the outside looking in, there seems to be a battle for its heart and soul raging between the old bull business as usual branch of the Republican Party and the Tea Party renegades. Would you care to handicap the outcome?
Yeah, and I see a different fight than that. I see a fight between the appropriators, Republicans who come to Washington and get put on the committee in charge of spending, and Tea Party Republicans, meaning Republicans who were elected in 2010 and 2012. They came into office with ringing in their ears an electorate screaming at them, stop spending so much money. And they have to deal with appropriators who've been here for 10 or 20 years for whom bringing money home in a earmark was considered a sign of manliness.
Right.
It is what you bragged about. It is what you put in your advertisements. You said, vote for me, I steal stuff from the rest of the country and bring it back and give it to people who live near you.
That's democracy.
Yeah, kleptocracy. So there's a huge shift. Now, the good news is that the leadership of the guys who run the House and the Senate have looked and counted and noticed that the vast majority of congressmen and senators, particularly in Congress, just showed up. So the majority of the Republican caucus in the House wants to kill and has voted to kill earmarks and to rein in spending, and they're with them on protecting the sequester. Mm-hmm. There are some older appropriators who still think that the spending in their zone can be good. They're probably against everybody else's spending, but they like their spending. Some of the defense guys think there's no money to be saved in defense, but someplace else maybe. I believe that as we move forward every 2 years, people who came up in a culture where appropriating and taking other people's money back to your district was considered a good thing, retire or pass away, and new people come up. It is as large a transition in the modern Republican Party as Reagan's election success was.
Interesting.
Pre-Reagan, cutting taxes was questionable, if you can imagine that. The day will come when we talk about, there used to be Republicans who thought spending money was a good idea, and you'd look at somebody and say, no, there wasn't. Nobody could possibly have thought that.
Every time they get in power, they spend like Democrats. That seems to be the history.
Well, the good news is that so far the guys who came in 10 and 12 have not gone native, but the reason why we have the sequester, this actual total spending as a percentage of GDP, even with Obama as president, went up high. It dropped from 22 down to 20% since the sequester. We've actually reduced spending as a percentage of the economy, not in total numbers, but as a percentage of the economy. If we hold that for a decade, we are in very good shape. And the present law is the sequester. We need to do better than that, but that's not a worst-case scenario.
As we get toward wrapping up, let's talk about tactics and winning. If the Tea Party renegades knock off the appropriators in primaries, doesn't that open the door for Democrats to take the seat and make it even worse?
Well, I'm in favor of nominating the most hard-working Reaganite Republican that can win the general election.
There's a proviso in there.
And in New Hampshire, that's Scott Brown. In Massachusetts, back in 2010, that was Scott Brown. If Scott Brown were a senator from Texas, I might be in favor of primarying him.
Yeah, okay.
Because in Texas, you could nominate and elect in the general somebody who voted more consistently right of center. But I want to add hardworking in there to conservative, because there's some guys who say, vote for me, I'm the most conservative person, I will go on Fox TV and give speeches. I want to know if you're a congressman from Minnesota and you have a Republican plus 12 district, that you don't consider your job to be getting yourself elected, which is easy, it's a Republican, overwhelmingly Republican district, and then you go have fun giving speeches. I want to know you are dragging every last Republican voter in your district to the polls so that Al Franken never gets elected, so that the Republican governor wins elections.
So you've succeeded in making yourself really scary to the audience here in Boston, which is one of the reasons I invited you on. What advice would you give the Republican Party when it comes to avoid getting lured into culture war issues rather than focusing on economic issues?
Well, I think two things. You don't back away from your positions. You stay what they are. But people want to know what you're focused on. And you get to decide that and talk to the interests of your voters. And right now, and usually, people don't want their taxes raised. They don't want their tax dollars wasted. They want to know the country will be defended, but they're not interested in going around and fixing everybody else's country with American dollars. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a great, great constituency for common sense, limited government. And the good news is that it was largely written down in the Constitution.
Oh, we've forgotten
about it. The Constitution was a good idea. And Massachusetts thought up half of it, for crying out loud.
They did. They really did.
They should take ownership.
Well, they've moved on. They've moved on. Grover, it's been a delight having you on the program. I really thank you for joining us, and I look forward to maybe sneaking into one of your meetings again someday.
Anytime. Give us a call, and we'll invite you. We'll put you in the red chair.
Thanks. You've been listening to Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Drop me a line at bill@realclearradio.org. Secretary Robert Reich is waiting on deck for his turn to convince you that Grover's wrong and that what this country needs is more taxes, not fewer. Stay tuned.